how can we distinguish when a trait is the product of adaptive evolution versus drift? So I need to tell you a little history first.
Okay.
Back in, I think, 1979, the very famous paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould and his less famous, very important geneticist, but less publicly famous geneticist friend, Richard Lewontin, published a very famous paper about the field of evolutionary biology. The paper is called The Spandrels of San Marcos, and it is about an architectural analogy for things that are seen in creatures, and it made a very forceful argument. The paper argued that evolutionary biologists were getting carried away with explanations that were adaptive. And the point was that in this cathedral, there were these things called spandrels. And the spandrels had these very beautiful pictures in them that made it seem like the spandrels had been created to house these pictures. I think there's one famous rotunda that has 4 pillars underneath this dome, and each of the pillars has a triangular spandrel that it creates, and the 4 spandrels have been filled in with maybe they're saints that represent different rivers or something like that. And it all looks like the spandrels are there for this very important purpose. Gould and Lewontin's argument was that the spandrels are actually an architectural accident of what happens when you put a dome on top of pillars. Now, this is not inherently true, but even if we grant that part of the puzzle, their argument had a kind of disastrous effect on evolutionary biology. It had a degree of truth in it. There was a tendency amongst evolutionists to gravitate in the direction of explanations for traits of creatures that seemed right, in spite of the fact that there wasn't sufficient evidence to know that these explanations were right. But what they said was, look, adaptations arise because you have genetic variation and because selection favors certain variants over others. So, if you're going to claim that something is an adaptation, you should demonstrate that the state that you wish to claim is adaptive is actually superior to the alternative states. And this all seems very reasonable and conservative. It's actually insane, right? When we get to a creature, very frequently the race is over. Whatever selective advantage the trait had is gone because all of the creatures have it. So you have what's called fixation, where every creature has the trait in question, and there's nothing to measure. So that's one problem. I mean,
that which remains becomes the definition of the creature, in a way.
It does, but I mean, let's just take a stupid example. Your heart has 4 chambers. It's quite clear that a 4-chambered heart has advantages in terms of efficiency because it isolates the oxygenated blood from that that's been depleted. There's no doubt that that's why it evolved. Even if there were humans that occasionally had that variance, and even if you had the budget to find the genes responsible for the difference, you're talking about an immense investment in research to prove something that's utterly obvious, which is that keeping the oxygenated blood separate from the depleted blood has efficiency advantages. So when I got to graduate school, I became frustrated by the fact that Gould and Lewontin's argument was still live, and that many of the people I was interacting with took it as an important set of criteria, whereas other people I dealt with understood that they needed to simply ignore it. This was not satisfying to me. I wanted to come up with a logically robust way to neutralize the part of that argument that wasn't real. And so I did. What I came up with was a test. And the test has 4 parts, and it allows you to restore the burden of proof to the way it should logically be. So Lewontin and Gould had reversed the burden of proof and basically set a very high bar for claiming that the traits that an organism has are the product of adaptive evolution. My point was, actually, almost every trait you could name of a creature is the product of adaptive evolution. And so it shouldn't have a high bar. Logically speaking, it shouldn't. Evolution is formally defined as changes in gene frequency within a population over time. That process, evolution, can be caused by various things. It can be caused by creatures migrating into a landscape, leaving a landscape, dying, or it can be caused by the fact that within that landscape, selection favors certain genetic variants over others. So only that last one creates adaptive evolution. The only process that creates anything meaningful is adaptive evolution. Drift can certainly change gene frequencies, but it can't create a wing or an eye or almost anything you could name. And
by meaningful, you mean something that persists and then becomes definitive of this organism?
No, I mean something you could name. There are examples of things you could name that don't have any adaptive meaning, but you actually have to work a little bit to find them. And let me come to some examples so that you can see what I mean. The test that I came up with involved 4 criteria. If all 4 criteria are met, you are logically justified in assuming that adaptive evolution is the explanation unless countervailing evidence arises. So the 4 characteristics are complexity. Complexity is only created at high degrees by adaptive evolution. In the non-adaptive part of the universe, there is nothing highly complex. There are some curious things. There are some structured things, but complexity is different. The second criterion is that the trait in question has to have a cost, and that cost can be in terms of materials, or it could be a cost in terms of risk that the organism takes, but some cost that the organism would be better off not paying if it weren't of some value. The third characteristic is that there has to be variation in the amount of cost that is spent, so that creatures that spend less would have a competitive advantage over creatures that spend more. And the fourth is persistence over evolutionary time. If a trait is complex, that suggests adaptive evolution. If it has a cost, and that cost varies, and yet creatures that pay the cost are not being outcompeted by creatures that save on the cost over evolutionary time, that suggests that the trait, in whatever way, is paying for itself. That is the core piece of logic that allows us to presume that some trait is a consequence of adaptive evolution. So if we look at the plant and we discover that the green color of the grass is the result of a pigment molecule. Well, the pigment molecule is complex, as is the metabolic process that creates it. The pigment molecule is costly. It's made out of materials that the grass could use for something else if it wanted to. It is variable. The degree to which a plant invests in chlorophyll varies. Some produce more per unit of volume of leaf, some produce less, and it persists over evolutionary time. Plants continue to be green. Now, we can say that we can presume that that molecule, and therefore the green color of the plants, is the result of adaptive evolution. The trick is, we cannot say, based on that evidence, what the green color is for. We can just say what process created it. Now, it happens that in the case of the color of plants, we know what the molecule does. The molecule absorbs light energy and turns it into chemical energy, which the plant can store and deploy for different things. But there are lots of cases in which a trait of an organism passes the test, but we don't know what it's for. For example, there's an extinct clade of creatures called pelycosaurs, amongst them Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon and the other pelycosaurs are very conspicuous. These are creatures that lived on the earth with the dinosaurs. They were not dinosaurs, but they lived at the same time. And they had these marvelous sails on their backs, these big sails that had bones sticking up to hold them open like a giant wing. We don't know whether the sails on the back of these animals collected sunlight to warm their blood, to give them an advantage so that they didn't have to warm up their dense bodies in the sunlight, or if they deterred predators. We can't say for sure. Now, it is possible, using fossil evidence, to answer a question like that. But we should not confuse the question of what is the sail on the back of the pelycosaur for with the question of, is it an adaptation? My point would be you have to separate those two questions. It is absolutely obvious that the sail on the back of the pelycosaur is an adaptation. There's no way that that sail would have ended up on so many species that lasted over so many generations if it was a waste. It had to be paying for itself. In what way was it paying for itself is a separate question, a more interesting question and a more difficult question. So I don't know if we will ever know the answer for sure, but the mistake that Lewontin and Gould caused us to make was to confuse these two questions, where if we couldn't explain what the sail was for, we had no justification for claiming it was for anything. And that's a logical fallacy. So let's take an example that fails the test. If we look at the coloration of naked mole rats, naked mole rats live almost their entire lives underground. They only very occasionally, one individual will leave one burrow, run across the African plains, and dive into another burrow. So they almost never end up in the light. They're in the dark for their whole lives. They are almost hairless, and they are some kind of gray color. Now, if that gray color is the result of a pigment, if there's a molecule that makes them gray, well, then it passes the adaptive test. On the other hand, if there's no molecule that makes them gray, if they are gray because being some color doesn't pay if you're in the dark, and so evolution has economized on making a pigment, and it's just allowed them to be whatever color you are if you've got no pigment, then, well, there's no cost to being the color they are, so we can't say that that color is adaptive. Now, surely the loss of the color is adaptive, and it's not incidental that a creature that lives where there's no light happens to be one that is abandoned making pigments. But from the point of view of saying that particular color of naked mole rats is adaptive, nope, I don't think we have that evidence. So my argument is not that this test shows us something amazing. It doesn't. It shows us something that ought to be obvious to us, something that was completely obvious to Darwin, incidentally, that when a creature spends on something, that it does so for a reason. And if it didn't do so for a reason, it would economize, and therefore it would reallocate whatever materials and energy it was spending on something else. So Darwin was sent a specimen, an orchid from Madagascar. I believe he was sent it by Bateman. And it was a very spectacular specimen in the sense that this orchid had a very long nectar tube, like a foot long. So the nectar was formed at the bottom of this very long tube that hangs off of this flower. And Darwin reasoned there must be a moth out there with a tongue long enough to get to the bottom of this thing. Otherwise, why would this plant make this amazing structure? It makes no sense for a plant to make a nectary that can't be accessed by a pollinator. And he did not live to see the answer, but in fact a moth, Xanthopan morgani, was discovered that in fact has this incredibly long tongue and does indeed pollinate this particular orchid. So my point is, Darwin was an amazing genius, one of the absolute greats. But this amazing genius was saying something perfectly straightforward, that it would not make sense if his hypothesis of natural selection was correct. It would not make sense for a plant to invest in a nectary that could not be accessed by any pollinator. It would not do anything useful for the plant. Therefore, in light of the fact that he was looking at this flower, there had to be a pollinator to match. That's obviously correct. My 4-part test of adaptation is a revival of that kind of thinking, and the whole idea is that it should free us from the absurd obstacles to claiming that something is an adaptation, which almost every trait of almost every creature that you could name is. And the reason to free us is not that it is so marvelous to point to all of these structures and say, they're the product of adaptive evolution. Of course they are. Adaptive evolution is the only process that creates high degrees of complexity in the first place.
That can persist through time.
Yeah, so virtually everything you could name about creatures ought to pass this test. The purpose of it, though, is for us to be able to move on to the interesting question. The interesting questions, the ones that preoccupy me and all of my evolutionarily oriented friends, are the questions about why. What is the value of this thing to the creature? And sometimes it's perfectly obvious, as in the case of a chlorophyll molecule that's capturing sunlight. And sometimes it's complex enough to stifle us for decades. Nobody has yet delivered a compelling explanation for why peacocks or peacock spiders or bowerbirds go through the incredible expense of males demonstrating to females something that is of no particular value in the raising of offspring. Why do females require this of males? So we've talked about this in a previous video, but the basic point is, look, that set of behaviors that we call lekking passes the adaptive test. Does that say what it's for? No, that's still an interesting question. Religion passes the adaptive test. It's complex, it's expensive, there's a variance in how much creatures spend on it, and it lasts over evolutionary time.
Lends an advantage to those that...
Right, but the point is we want to be liberated from the question of, is it adaptive, in order to pursue the question, how could that possibly be adaptive? Why would believing in heaven or hell or deities who are liable to respond to your prayers, why would that be good for you? Right? It wouldn't be better for you to think, hey, there's nobody out there, I better look out for myself. First order, it sort of seems like that would be the way to go. Apparently not. Apparently people believe in that somebody gives a damn about them and is watching over them, and that if they happen to end up in some circumstance they can't get themselves out of, and they've kept their account clean with, the sky god, that they will end up in some great place forever. Somehow that belief appears to be valuable. Well, that's a worthy thing to study. How could it be? So anyway, my point is, being freed from the question of whether or not things are adaptive leaves us open to study in what way things that are obviously adaptive are beneficial, and that's where the interesting stuff in evolutionary biology happens.